Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to cover Project Pegasus. Now, you may have heard of Project Pegasus and you may not have. This is going to involve a gentleman who claims to have been a part of a program that the government created pretty much from the moment he was born, where he was traveling in time, he was traveling from place to place. He has a lot of claims, and he debuted this on November 11, 2009 on the AM show Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. That's the first time we heard about this. I actually caught that episode in my car and I finally finished it off. It was quite an episode. And I've mentioned this several times in other episodes. And I mentioned it just recently in one of my, History's Mysteries kind of episodes, the 3 volumes I did. We're going to dive into this, and then we're going to go all the way around everything. I'm going to give you a lot of history on a lot of organizations that we talk about all the time, but we don't know exactly, well, when did it start? And what did they look into? What did they claim they looked into? What have others claimed they looked into? So we're going to have a lot of fun with this. But the gentleman's name is Andrew D, I think I'm saying this right, Basiago. He's a very intelligent human being. He does have degrees. He was born September 18th, 1961. But he has a BA in history from UCLA. Not an easy school to get into necessarily, and it does cost a fair amount of money. He has a Master of Philosophy in the University of Cambridge, which is I think it's a subdivision of Cambridge. He got a law degree from Lewis and Clark School up in Portland, Oregon. And he was finally admitted to the Washington Bar in 1996. So we're not talking about an idiot here. We're talking about a really smart guy. I'm just going to take you through what he's claimed, and then we're going to dive around kind of what that could mean. We're going to get into time travel again. I've done a little bit more research for those of you who've heard other time travel mentions and science. We're going to get into sort of what is the official sort of take on anyone in the world ever claiming to have a theory of how they're going to do it. We're going to get into organizations like DARPA. How did it create itself? Like, who made it? What's the history of it? But let's get into his claims really quickly here. So he's got 2 sides to his life, and we're going to go backwards second. We're going to talk about kind of what he claimed as a child. But let's go ahead and go for the gusto of what Project Pegasus was all about. Now, he said he was the team leader of Project Pegasus. And once you hear what it's supposed to be doing, that's quite an accomplishment here. He might be the right guy for the job, if there was the job at all. But he said, he's the founder and president of the Mars Anomaly Research Society, which also stands for Mars. But he said that, and this is the funny one, okay, because a few people have obsessed on Nikola Tesla more than myself, including looking through his handwritten paperwork I got from the Tesla Societies, who had me decipher the death ray and how it worked, right? But he said that based on hidden technologies of Tesla, that they were able to derive, again, no claim at all as to how this thing works. It's kind of interesting if you were kind of the person that was leading an organization that travels in time, and you've been on the radio, and even Bob Lazar at least takes the time to explain how he thinks the antimatter engines work in the supermodel UFO hidden in S4. He talks all about exactly how it routes the power and how it routes the atomic matter to achieve antimatter. At least he does that. Now, I never heard Andrew on Coast to Coast AM talk about how this time travel stuff is supposed to work. It just exists, okay? But he says that under DARPA, which existed far before Andrew was born, under ARPA, and then it became DARPA. This is an Eisenhower creation we're going to get into. That he was involved by the 80s. Okay, so now he would be in his 20s, right? So in 61 he's born, 81 he's 20, and it was called the Mars Jump Room. Great idea. The guy really thought this out. If it wasn't real, he does a great job at this. But he said that during the use of this program, they were able to prove that there was humanoid life on Mars. And hey, there could have been humanoid life on Mars. There's certainly a lot of structures on Mars that seem, well, if they're real, which You know, a lot of us debate whether or not they could put a vehicle in orbit 160 million miles away at the closest range. I tend to think they can't do that. You know, we got episodes on that whole thing. But he said that in 2008, this was actually proven that these humanoids existed on Mars due to this JUMP program. You know, that's a long ways away. So 80s, 90s, and then 2000, it's almost 30 years, almost, right? But by 2009, he had helped to form, because he does have a law degree, right? Trying to create some legislation and laws around the Martians that live on Mars so that they have some protection. Because apparently, you know, they can't do it themselves. We have to do it for them from Earth, right? So this program is actually not just time travel, it's also teleportation. Which could, you know, hey, if you could time travel, you should be able to teleport, right? Because it's just, hey, I want to go in that room over there and I want to follow the chronological time that I'm in right now. So add a few milliseconds or whatever to get me over there. However long the transport takes, simply add that differential to my arrival time. Therefore, I don't slip in time at all. Okay. Now, we have what's called astronauts here, right? And a lot of people think that NOTS is NOTS in this world, and I think that's a very founded theory. But he has chrononauts. I mean, how brilliant is that, right? Chrono being time knots, time astronauts. It's a great designation. I mean, the guy should be a fictional writer. He would make probably so much more money just turning these into books than doing a few interviews here and there, which has a really short lifespan, right? But he said that he went back to 1863 to Gettysburg, and because he got inducted into this, according to him, in the 60s. And so as soon as he's like, 8 to 12, which put him in the 70s, he's there, and there's a kid in the photo. Looks like a kid, anyway. Could be a smaller statured man, but looks like a kid. He's got a little hat on. They don't quite wear at the time, right? And it's a blurry kid too. So it's a great thing to pick in a photograph, which has obviously been in history since 1863. And he says, that's me at the event. But he also does something very interesting. He claims to, I guess, I don't know, add a little credibility to the story. In 2017, he says that Barack Obama was also a part of this program and traveling around with him. He doesn't say it happened in 2017. He simply says in 2017 that this is one of the added attributes of the situation. Okay. Could be some misdirection for your mind. He said Barack Obama. That's got to be, it's just like, let's say we didn't go to the moon. Let's say that's completely impossible since we haven't done it in 50 years and we got 1 billion times more technology now and we can't pull it off, okay? If we say, okay, we're going to get some of the astronauts who are still alive living in Malibu to simply go to ufology meetups and clubs and say, why we can't go back, man, because there's aliens on it. Okay, we can kind of see the moon. That's the good part. So if they're there, they don't have a really huge presence. They're not building giant cities and all that kind of stuff. Now, you can't convince John Lear that because every time he sees a little bump, he's pretty sure that's a moon base. And of course, who knows what's on the other side of the moon? Dark side, right? We got soldiers up there, supposedly. Now, good old Barry Obama. He supposedly got in the program when he was 19 years old. What's interesting about that is that since when a person becomes president, their history of their entire life becomes pretty well documented, right? Not just because publishers want to revise history or what have you, but because people know these people and they saw them every single day. And so if I were to say, for instance, at 19 that I was somehow jumping through time and all that kind of stuff, when would I be doing that? Because I was working almost 7 days a week. But if I wasn't working 7 days a week and I had a weekend, I was hanging out with my friends. And they may not know a particular date or time, but I would have to kind of say, well, I know you can't remember all the days in the year, so I'm going to pick one of those. There's a weekend where I didn't see you. That's where I was on Mars. Okay. Again, this is just allegedly. Allegedly, this happened to this guy, right? He also claims that the White House has these teleportation devices within the bowels of the White House to get the president out of a bad situation. And what's interesting about that is that I think we've had it officially announced technology hasn't been confirmed yet, but that there is high-speed rail underneath the White House such that the president needs to get pretty much to Kansas really fast. The rumors are that there's trains up to Mach 3 underground. It doesn't have to be Mach 3 to be utterly amazing. How about just 600, 700 miles an hour? How about 1,000 miles an hour? That means within an hour and a half, he could be pretty much in the center of the United States. And if that sounds a little bit strange, well, that's because most of the thought process that we have about that technology is all above ground. If you had a military-controlled rail, you have to have 3 pipes, right? One going one way, one coming the other way, and the service tunnel in between that will exhaust the air out the top. Otherwise, these trains would explode if they passed each other, something they found out with the tunnel. But you had, it's military guarded. There's no rodents down there. There's no people down there. You could blast a train in some sort of maglev format at ridiculous levels, just making sure the vehicle itself mechanically can't come off the rails and kill everybody down there, because at that speed it would be really bad to have a bird fly in front of the train, right? But that's something I think they could potentially control to get at least up to some near first level Mach. But of course, what happens when you break the sound barrier underground and you have that shock wave happen? I don't know. Technology I have not heard figured out yet. But his contention was that he was inducted very early, and we're going to get into his kind of earlier claims here. It's not much to it, but he said that from 62 to 72, that would constitute pretty much his childhood, right? He'd be 11 years old in 72. That the organization, DARPA and the other eyeball agency, they were going to test this on children. Of course, you want to test it on the little kids. Doesn't make any sense to me, but apparently adults had done it already. The charter of this entire program, and what's fascinating to me is that when he claims he's sort of the leader of this Project Pegasus group, that means it didn't have that name until he was old enough to be the leader. And I don't know if you had a prodigy child on your hands. I don't know. There's academic knowledge that will give you the prodigy level, and then there's that sort of management and logistic human engagement side that is really the executive branch of your brain that needs experience in order to know how to do things. I mean, you would have to be literally born with the knowledge to pull this off if you're going to get the promotion beforehand. But he said that the chrononauts were trying to grab, history before it happens so that we can make better decisions. Trust me, we're going to get into Project Looking Glass and a few other things too. But then you have the basis of the technology that is never explained, but he mentions apparently, it's been a while since I heard the Coast to Coast one, but he mentions the fact that it's, unpublished paperwork of Tesla, which is the big story about the fact that when he died, that, Donald Trump's uncle went in and got all the paperwork, and he was a legit dude, man. That guy was a big MIT physicist, and he went in there and grabbed it. But I have studied every single word I can find that Tesla ever spoke in public, from magazine interviews to his autobiography to his paperwork that was not published but was sent to me, which I featured in my Scalar Pulses episode, where I actually show you the scans of what I was sent to decipher the death ray, which then gave me pretty much what I needed to go and find out how the Wardenclyffe Tower actually worked, as opposed to some of the theories, right? But they said that, quantum physics and the unpublished works of Tesla pretty much constitute all you need to know about how time travel works. Okay, I got a whole section in this episode that's going to be about sort of recapping where the world is right this very second with any theory of time travel, and then I've got a few of my own observations that I've developed since the last time I mentioned this a few episodes back, so stay tuned, right? Of course, his assertion is that this is a shadow project and that it was eventually shut down, which then automatically grants him permission to talk about such a project without a 20-year gag, which is an intelligence agent with the letter C at the beginning, that agency. You don't get to quit without 20-year gags on you. You simply don't. I had a best friend of mine, a mentor, who was deep in their organization during the 80s, building Star Wars, doing AI coding for satellites. He was my boss. He was my mentor. He's one of my best friends, and he passed away a few years ago of a massive heart attack at a very young age, which is early 60s. So he was gagged from having his photo taken for 20 years. I mentioned the organization on the phone once, like I said in a previous episode, and his phone was disconnected. It wasn't just a busy signal. He wasn't just not answering his phone after I got cut off from him. It didn't work, and I got a voicemail, or not voicemail, I got a voice message from this weird operator talking about how this phone was no longer accessible, and they basically just penalized the line for a certain amount of time so no one can call back. So stop having that conversation, right? But Andrew says he was inducted into the program at 6. So he's born in 61. He's in 67. I shouldn't say he said it, but I think this is what he actually claimed, because most of the sources are all trying to gather what he has said at a podcast, said in a book, said at interviews on the radio. So by the time 1972 arrives, he's already been to Gettysburg and back. 1963, has his photograph taken with, in the same photograph, they say Lincoln's head is moving through a crowd without his hat on. Now, unlike a lot of clandestine projects that are old and mothballed, this particular project, I'm just saying, it doesn't have any formal designation whatsoever. Doesn't mean it didn't exist, but it has no formal designation whatsoever as having ever existed. And again, if we had time travel capabilities within the United States of America and say Russia didn't, or any one of our other opponents, I don't think we'd lose a lot of wars, because we would know what's going to happen. We would know where the missiles were that were going to launch towards us. We could just simply bomb them a few minutes before they get their bombs out. You could, it's just like Edge of Tomorrow with Tom Cruise. You could just keep watching the war until you get the perfect recipe, and the enemy can't. And you're doing this in your same timeline, right? You're going forward looking, and then you could go forward and see if that plan, because you brought the information back, you change the future, then you go back to the future and you take a look. Okay, we bombed those, but there was a secondary, so you hit the secondaries, and so we got to have 50 bombs, and then we don't have a war going on, right? Nothing indicates we have that power, okay, that I know of, right? So let's go to Nikola Tesla real quick. I have not read a single word of any credible source, and this is prior to really yellow journalism reaching out and trying to revise history. You had Einstein's whole thing to try and get rid of most of the theories that created actually tangible objects, right? Einstein is nothing more than a theorist, and he's theoretically correct. He's always theoretically this, theoretically that. He's never hardcore. You have a television that uses electronics because of because of Einstein. That never happened. It's all because of Tesla refining all these parts so that we could eventually get to miniaturization. He refined how resistors worked, and transistors and coils and capacitors. It was that dude that made Marconi, who used almost 50 of his patents, capable of creating a radio that you know today. But again, Tesla had already created a remote control boat that he put in the Hudson Bay in 1898 with a communication, with a remote control, with a protocol to talk to the boat. So Tesla was like this in terms of just having ingested literally hundreds of hours of his content. My take on him is that he was a very honest, sweet man. He had suffered a illness when he was a child. His father brought him engineering books while he was in bed. And however he healed up his mind, while reading this content, it all clicked with him. He could see electricity. He could see the dielectric and the magnetic turning into electromagnetic. He could see it. So he was a master, a grand master of how electrons came into fruition and how to make that recipe happen through like all kinds of different forms of induction. With the internet, you have that formula, which you guys all know. Someone shows a picture of Tesla's face, and then they put a quote off to the side, and then they say, he said it. The thing is that he was very popular within his own life. He was a legend in his own time. He really was. He created the AC motor and lived decades after that moment. lighting up the world in a way that generators from water, from all kinds of different spinning turbines, from steam, coal, even oil, could generate electricity with a spinning motor. So he was interviewed a lot, and he talked a lot. And the only time you ever saw him get a little sassy in an interview is if the person who's interviewing him is trying to say that someone else was more accomplished than him in an area where he was way more accomplished than that other person, such as when Marconi came out with the radio, people said, well, what do you think about Marconi beating you to the radio? He didn't care. He'd already done it. He had done it decades before and simply said, well, he's using 50 of my patents, so I'm not really that worried, right? I think it was around 48 of his patents or 49 of his patents. Okay, fine. And he patented everything he touched, Tesla. If he had, and he was selling the death ray. He didn't call it the death ray, but he was selling this sort of strategic Wardenclyffe Tower device to melt any incoming airplanes, to melt tanks coming in. He had figured this whole thing out and said, I don't have to actually get rid of the entire vehicle. I just have to vaporize all the screws. And he was such a sweet guy. He was trying to figure out a way to make sure that if a pilot was in a plane, say over the ocean or over whatever, coming at the United States or coming at an allied country, if his tower blasted all the screws out of it by doing a directed energy weapon beam to atomize whatever metal that particular screw is made out of. Like the whole thing could be made out of aluminum, but it has like steel rivets. Well, he would tune his ray to steel and vaporize that into dust, making the plane fall apart. He was desperately trying to figure out a way to say, make sure you wear your parachute, and that when the canopy's over your head, you got to have a mechanism to get out from under the canopy before you pull your parachute. Trying to make sure the pilots would live. I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. When he figured out chemical weapons, actually created a chemical that was heavier than air. He was writing back to his home country, and everybody got hit by these things. He said, look, if you think you're going to be the victim of a chemical weapon, he goes, make sure you're living next to a hill or a mountain that you can climb up very quickly. And he says, the second you think they're dropping this stuff on you, run up into the hills because it's heavier than air and it will go down into the valley. Just wait till the coast is clear and you'll be okay. That's the kind of guy he was. So the idea that he had somehow penetrated any semblance of time, but didn't write it down and didn't talk about it, is very uncharacteristic of this guy. Now you might say, just like Peaceful Valley and Twilight Zone, there's an invention created by some alien and you don't want to give it to the rest of mankind because they will turn it into a weapon. That he might have hid that technology in that particular manner, but I think he might allude to it still. The only rumor I have ever heard, unsubstantiated, was that when he was in Springfield, Colorado, and he was creating that big giant Tesla coil that, ripped off a piece of electricity that filled up the room. You've seen the picture. And that it lasted for 60 seconds. And that's a very long time to be listening to that kind of racket. Imagine a lightning bolt going off in the room for 60 seconds and you're in a chair reading a book. Weird. And he's, it was definitely confirmed that it went for 60 seconds until the assistant broke the breaker. Just like one of those old Frankenstein breakers, right? There was a claim that when he said he was looking at his assistant, that it seemed like the assistant was moving in slow motion, which would mean that if that was the case, he would have been in a different timetable and he would have felt like it was more than 60 seconds. He would have had to have felt like if the person's moving 50%, he's in there for 2 minutes. If the person's moving at 25%, he's been in that problem for 4 minutes. But he never elaborated about that anywhere. And so that was where you might have more of an internet meme than actual reality. Just keep that in mind. Now, the only other real significant thing about Andrew is that he ran for president in 2016. Said he was going to potentially run in 2020. And of course, most of you are looking at that going, well, yeah, if you could see the future, why would you do that? I have helped a series of people run for office in my lifetime. And one of the things that becomes apparent, because all these weird people run for office, they run for office in a way that there's no way they could ever win. But they still show up and they do a few stomps and they raise money. Okay. I believe I have this correct in that if you raise, say, $50,000 trying to run for some office and you lose, there's no need for you and there's no method for you to give back the $50K because you've spent some of it on your campaign. But if there's anything left in the bank, you get to keep it. So I have known single fathers of 4 kids run because they make a bunch of money. And a lot of these people are absolute dopes. And I know one guy that has run for office nearly every year for 30 years. He has never come close to winning, but he does it because he raises money and gets to keep it. It's a little business. It's not exactly easy to do this, right? But if you develop the machine, and now there's actually web companies out there that because they know this scam, what they say is, we'll make everything for you, but we take 90% of every dollar you raise because they know it's a scam. They know you're not going to say anything. It's legal anyway. And they basically just use a face. They say, hey, you wouldn't make any money anyway. So we'll pump you way up. You'll make way more money than you would. And that 10% that you're going to grab, well, that's what you would have made by yourself. How about that? Now let's talk about time travel for a split second. One more time. Because it's important that we understand that it's really an entertainment concept. Rod Serling made an episode where a guy goes back in time and actually meets himself as a young kid. But the whole story is more about him going back in time to a time that was much easier for him because he had become a high-end marketing executive. And it was, sort of push, 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 That's this episode called Willoughby. But the other one with Guy Young in it. Rod mentioned this episode several times because even as a very intellectual, well-spoken, well-written man, he still yearned for that childhood that he had as a kid. And I think a lot of us, if you have a decent childhood, you can't help but reminisce. And so that's really the thrust for time travel, especially in terms of going backwards. Now, there's probably a category of people that aren't very, very fond of their childhood, and the fantasy is to go back in time to some completely different era. You want to go back to the 40s, or you want to go see Napoleon do his thing. Or you're really gutsy and you want to go into the future. But what would time be, right? Douglas Adams, again, he said it perfectly. He said, time is an illusion. Lunchtime, doubly so. Now, I'm going to give you a very basic analogy for what time travel would probably cause if it were to ever occur. What if you had a container that was full and it was capped off? It was completely sealed, welded shut. There is not a single air particle in that container. It is full. And then suddenly, you were able to teleport into the guts of that container, I don't know, an ice cube size of whatever that container already has in it. If it has water in it, you're putting an ice cube of water in there. What's going to happen to that container? Instantaneously, what's going to happen to that container? Well, it's either going to have to bend bigger and just swell automatically. The particles that create the container are going to have some leeway to create space for that brand new object that's been put inside of it, or it's going to explode automatically because it doesn't have any room for something else to be added to it. Now, regardless of what you believe about where the universe came from and what model you want to adopt, it's pretty safe to say that this is a very balanced ecosystem of either quantum waves or ethereal particles or some godlike container that holds us all in this place. Now, how the container happens, we don't have to debate that right now. But if you were to take yourself and go back in time, meaning you're going to have to take the quantum fields of your body on a scientific official basis, and you're going to move it back to 1863. Even though you're just the ice cube and it may be a giant container, you're now adding brand new force into that universe. And what do you do with the stuff that was there where you arrive? Let's say you volumetrically are like a 5'10" guy. You weigh 180 pounds. You're pretty buff. And you got gear on and whatever. You got the little device that remote control takes you back home, which should be explained by somebody. It was never explained in Twilight Zones. Red Dwarf has it, but that's about it. But you land, you're going to have to take all of the air, all of whatever makes this universe occur, ethereal particles, quantum fields, or some combination of the two, and you're going to have to bring that back to our time so you can exchange the emptiness to create room in the universe for you to exist. And even though you think you're infinitely small, well, you might just disrupt the entire universe if you went back in time. It's the butterfly effect, right? A butterfly in Peru flying across the jungle will change the tea in China at some point. It's going to affect everything. And you just plopping in 1863 could create a concussive imbalance. And technically speaking, if you don't get the stuff out of the way by the time you arrive, then that stuff's going to be embedded in you. And I doubt you could live. You'd probably get the bends just standing up. All that oxygen go right in your body. And you'd just be dead in a few seconds, right? So it's important to have this stuff explained, right? But going back in time would mean that every frame of the universe in the most minute amount of time is being stored somewhere in memory. And that you're merely jumping from your memory to the other memory that's somehow being stored. It's not organic. As everything is created, you're simply jumping into maybe a cube of a matrix of time, right? You're in this upper corner of the cube and you're jumping down this other form of the cube, and somehow this is all linked together in some linear manner. If that sounds completely ridiculous, it's probably because it is. When time goes away, it goes away. And to somehow create a device that would reconfigure the entire universe, because it has to be the entire universe, right? I saw Halley's Comet in 1985. You're undoing that last visit, and then what is it, 75 years before that, it's going to arrive again, and 75 years before that, it's going to arrive again. You'd have to undo everything out there. The stars would have to be exactly the way they were. Everything is going to have to be the way it was. And it can't be done by some finite device in the middle of a room. And I just want to state again, there is no official announcement of any intelligence agency anywhere in the world history that claims that they have ever accomplished any form of time travel. And you would think that having access to the brightest minds and the brightest computers, especially with the AI stuff going on right now and all the big machine learning stuff going on right now, that this would be made possible. However, there's a bit of an AI loophole, and it's called Project Looking Glass. Now, Project Looking Glass actually goes back quite a ways. The entire theory of it was suggested sort of anonymously by a whistleblower, supposedly in the early 2000s, with no evidence, no reference, no nothing. But there was a bit of a sort of predictive programming thing that you might have seen had you watched the entire series on HBO called Westworld. There was a big giant computer, and it's been done several times in different movies. This is one of the best ones. Imagine having a computer that's allowed to ingest every single cause and effect that we've ever recorded in history. And we're talking about the people that know what really happened in history, not just our revised stuff that comes out of Europe. And then they were turned on to the social media. This is 100% valid information. Bobby wants to meet Sally. Sally wants to meet Bobby. Herbert is actually a 14-year-old girl in his mind and buys little, Barbie dolls and that kind of stuff. Every single thing that Westworld was by season 2 was all about trying to harvest the cause and effect that human beings have to buy products. Now, that's a very shallow take of this technology. But now imagine you create, and we always know they create these big supercomputers that aren't announced to the public, that perhaps run on slightly different technology. Maybe technology that doesn't use silicone, that uses atomic matter, called a quantum computer. Doesn't have to. But whatever they configure together, it gets to a point where it can predict and double check and triple check and quadrillion check any prediction of anything going on. Well, I think, the stock market might do that. Well, if we do this and that, and if he does this and that, and imagine you're feeding it the best intel in the world. You're rating every single communication protocol from 4 countries, and they don't even know that it's happening. And it's all going in there. And it gets to a point it can start predicting things. And of course, they're testing it every single day. Maybe they're letting it have the idea that it has a little bit of authority, but it doesn't really affect anything. Human beings, in the short term, still vet the predictions. But that first stage would be just predictions, getting the chaos, the James Gleick book, all figured out. And then you start reversing it. We want this to happen. How do we make this happen? Instead of just sitting around predicting things, we need you to engage reality and make sure that if we want kids to be all confused, what movies do we make? What themes do we focus on? What products do we sell them? How do we entrap someone to go a particular direction with their life so we have control over them? This is what I believe any remnants of a Project Looking Glass would actually end up doing. It's not observational. It's instructional. It's a control apparatus. And it's pretty brilliant. So Andrew added a couple interesting elements, attributes about himself. He said that he was what's called an indigo child, which I'd never heard this before, but apparently that's just slang for a kid who's kind of psychic. What's interesting about that is, other than a few parlor tricks as a child, if anyone had that sort of capability, and again, Stanford University, I've mentioned just recently, has actually proven that kids under 5 actually have quite a bit of ability, way over the 21% of randomness, to predict what someone's thinking. They've done these experiments. One of my coworkers, I believe it was her son that was in it, but he was like 7, and the problem was he was in there from 6 to 7 to 8, I believe. But as he got older, they say this just naturally wears off, and it makes sense. As a child, you don't have communication, so it's very, very important. You can read a face, figure out, what your mom and dad are thinking, figure out where you are. But they said it went beyond that, that once they started, especially these prodigy kids that could talk early, that they were able to prove, they would look at the adult would look at a color, a number, a card, and a deck. And as long as the child understood how to read that and communicate back, that they were actually in the sort of low 40s. And that's quite a bit. It's still, the odds are still on the house that you're not going to get it right, but that's pretty good. So if you were this indigo kid, one would think that would play a big role in Andrew's future. And I'm unaware of any claim that he's made where, in addition to his other academic prowess, which is definitely a smart dude, that he was able to leverage that, ability into his future, into this program, such that it would actually produce something that no one else could produce. For instance, the fictional movie Brainstorm had people that were gifted in going into people's dreams. And it was just a few people that they had found in the entire world that could do this. And they had a nemesis, and they had a protagonist, and they actually went at it inside the president's mind. If you haven't seen that movie, I covered it. But we talked about Tesla. We talked about the fact that unpublished papers of Tesla, which obviously there are scribblings and inventions that he had put down, which I will tell you, reading his handwriting, these scans are so good. The scans I have, I can see the writing on the other side of the piece of paper. I have the other side as well scanned. That's how decent the scans were. If I print this out on the same kind of paper, you wouldn't be able to tell. It's crazy. That wasn't real. But he had knowledge in his head that he didn't need to write down. He was talking to himself in the paperwork. And that's the first thing anyone who's studying Tesla's paperwork needs to realize. What he didn't understand, or what he was developing that he needed to see a picture of, and I believe if he's like any one of us, once you write something down, you don't necessarily have to read it again because you analog that into the back of your mind, and you can always see that in your head once you write it down. That's why they always say when you have goals, write it down on a piece of paper. Don't type it in a computer because that doesn't work. You have to analog it out. But for instance, as far as I could tell, from what he was designing as a weapon that was a Tesla coil weapon, the entire object was an algorithm. How tall it was, the shielding on the outside of it, the types of Tesla coils he would build inside of it, the dome on the top, all of this was an algorithm of a circuit. Just like if you know anything about transformers, you can't make a tremendous amount of power out of a tiny transformer. Tiny transformers have small power. Big transformers have big power. even though a little one will knock you on your butt. But the other thing about Tesla and time travel, okay, is if you were Tesla and you had figured out time travel, and you had figured out that your Wardenclyffe Tower was defunded because you admitted to JP Morgan that you were going to give away power for free, and this dude's going to sell it by the unit, and he defunds your project and you can never get it done. That was 1917, people. I believe that's the year it got defunded. Well, he lived to like 46, right? 1946 or so, right? He's like 85, 86 years old. Don't you think he'd go back for that one conversation and undo what he said? Oh, man, it's nothing. It's going to be really cool. It makes Christmas lights happen in everyone's house for free. It'll help you sell units of power, Mr. JP Morgan. He would have undone some little tiny mistakes in his life to make sure that his ultimate goal of giving away power for free was going to happen. But it never happened because he didn't have time travel. The other thing to keep in mind is that Tesla dies, a few days after getting hit by a car walking across the street. He took himself to the hospital. He was in his hotel room. Why would he be living in a hotel room, even though it was paid for by one of his fans, a guy that owned the hotel, and it ran on AC power, by the way. That was one of his policies. But why would he be sitting in a hotel room and not in some laboratory somewhere? The dude's Nikola Tesla. It's the 40s. He could find someone that would put him up so he could actually continue his experiments, because the idea that he has somehow cracked time travel and he's just going to hang out in a hotel room seems pretty illogical, right? But now let's move on to DARPA. What is DARPA? When was it created? Who created it? Why was it created? Well, February 7th, 1958, Dwight D. Eisenhower creates ARPA, Advanced Research Project Agency. And it was in response to Sputnik, the rumor that the Soviet Unions had put a satellite in space that was beaming down some beeps, right? And it came over the United States and it was hauling ass, okay? So the idea is we got to see it. We got to hear it. We didn't see it technically, but we got to hear it beeping down. So that kind of made us think, oh my God, they really did it. This isn't just a claim. We actually got the radio broadcast from this thing. That had happened on October 4th, 1957, a year before. Now, just a little take on the name. It was ARPA to begin with, and then they added the word defense in front of ARPA, where it becomes DARPA, and that's 1972. And then oddly, really strange, during Clinton's administration, not because of Clinton, in 93, it was renamed to ARPA. Weird. And then in 1996, 3 years later, it goes back to DARPA. Interesting, right? Now, the charter of this division is actually very fascinating. It was set up so that, well, one, you have to create an organization before you can have a line item and a ledger, meaning raising money for something, right? But part of it was to say, okay, we're going to make this mostly defense-oriented, but we're also going to make it private sector-oriented. But the stages of anything private sector are going to be behind the scenes, sort of skunk works kind of thing, not aeronautical necessarily, but skunk works kind of hidden projects until we figure out how this technology can be safely deployed to the public. And of course, we know by the 21st century, this was designed as a control apparatus that's been very efficient. We'll get to that in just a second. But really, its main focus was missile defense. Now, if any of you do any ICBM research, you'll know that we were creating, rockets that were pretty impressive in the late 50s. We'd seen the V-2 rocket by Wernher von Braun. Of course, we smuggle him in through Operation Paperclip. Technically a Nazi. I mean, there's plenty of photographs with him and all the bad boys together. He wasn't that classic, Jewish scientist in a tunnel somewhere. He was one of the Aryan Brotherhood, man, let me tell you. And just a little caveat to some of the footage that you'll see from 58 to 59. When Twilight Zone and other shows, even I think X-1 soundtracks, when they wanted to show a rocket landing or taking off, there's several episodes of this, they would use actual footage from the late 50s. That's usually what you were seeing. And there's a couple real famous shots, the stuff taking off. But what happens really soon after this whole thing goes into a defense mode? Well, its initial charter was missile defense, space, and early computing. Pretty cool, other than the missile thing, which is sort of the darker side of the technology, we greenlight this mission to the moon, to put a guy on the moon back, get it done in 10 years. And as I've always asserted, that was a cover story for developing the ICBM technology, which again, once we get done in 72, supposedly going to the moon for the 6th time, technically 7th time, but only landing a 6th time, the Trident missile system starts, showing its perfection in 1974, where you got a missile popping out of the water and blasting off its casing and taking off, and it can go anywhere in the world we need to put it, right? Plus, they drive right up to your doorway and blast it through the window, right? So submarines are some of the most incredible military inventions ever made, ever, right? Eventually, the computer technology gets to the point where all kinds of amazing things are occurring, right? The innovation of computers in general is happening, the physical innovation of how they work, miniaturizing them from being warehouses running on tape to running on all kinds of different mediums, right? The pixel's invented in 1968. So now we can control a screen with a video card. Very important thing. By 1972, we have our first sort of asteroids game, which you can see in the movie Soylent Green. It's a real machine in that movie at the very beginning of the film that you can look up. Go see my episode on Soylent Green, and I'll tell you which brand made it. But they started getting to artificial intelligence by the 70s. Now, we're going to get into the internet here in 1 second. But when my buddy starts programming these satellites in the early 80s, again, I've held a schematic of some of these Star Wars satellites, and he said, look, they deployed that. They told the public they didn't deploy it, but it's all up there. And again, now it's been replaced 20 times, right? But he was programming in Lisp, full programming in Lisp AI by the 80s, early 80s, okay? I think he spent from 79 to 89 in this organization. He went to Dartmouth University. He was a mega prodigy, okay? Upper class guy. Lots of money. Genius dude. How was that technology ready for him to program if it wasn't developed 10, 15 years earlier? You have to conceive of this, right? So you've got Stanley Kubrick coming out with the HAL 9000. I used to have a book that was all about the history of AI computer scientists from the early days, seeing that movie and then basically saying, that's the reason why I got into artificial intelligence. And I guarantee you that's a truth for a lot of the earlier programmers. So DARPA is part of this. But now, go back to the line item concept. Without an organization, you can't raise money from Congress to go do these things, right? NASA most likely was a sort of a friendly side organization that was developing the technology that would get immediately leaked over to anyone creating the ICBM program. But they were one of the first organizations to fund special projects inside MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon. Again, light items get to go places, so you can actually start building an organization once you create a business. So then we have something called ARPANET. Take the D off, go back to the ARPA acronym, because it didn't happen until 72 officially, right? And you've got ARPANET. And this is the very first version of the internet. Now, initially, they didn't supposedly have the TCP/IP protocol as a part of that. The interesting thing about that, if I said that and you just went, whoa, what's that? The TCP/IP packet is an idea of, if you know how Telegram works, from, to, start, message, stop, you know exactly what a TCP/IP packet looks like, just so you know. But it was how this was routed that was the most important thing. So imagine you're back in the settler days, and it's maybe the 1880s, and there's telegram poles pretty much in every major town. But if you're trying to send a message, let's say from Kansas City to Wichita, Kansas, and a tornado went through the lines in the middle, then you can't get the message through. And they might say, well, I can't get the message through because the lines are down. So what would they do? They would say, okay, why don't you send the message, further west, and then from west to south? Let's see if we can get around the broken poles by using towns that didn't get hit by the tornado. Because it didn't hit Wichita and it didn't hit Kansas City. All right. That's the way the TCP/IP packet works. It tries to go through the closest, shortest distance. If it can't do it, it then algorithmically maps through testing, little electronic pulses called pings, who's the closest next route. And this is because the military realized that if cities got bombed, we may not be able to have East Coast talk to West Coast. This is before satellite technology and other means of communication. But DARPA was also responsible for supposedly developing the F-117, which is the first stealth fighter you ever saw. These were big in Desert Storm and what have you. Then you cross over to the 2000s. And I know I'm a million miles away from the Project Pegasus. But this is to set a foundation so you understand kind of what's actually happening in the real world while Andrew's supposedly having this time travel, teleportation, jumping thing, right? But they created a website called LifeLog internally. This became Facebook. 100%, the code was just shipped over, renamed, this fake guy's put in the front, a bunch of money is raised from a little organization in Palo Alto called Incutel, who makes technology for that other eyeball organization. And suddenly, you've got the artery that Project Looking Glass really needs. They said that Project Looking Glass, as part of this sort of undisclosed whistleblower, it was an early 2000s, late 1990s thing. But without the artery, you don't have actually the information to actually make it tick. And so you got to create something where people are going to put their face into the system. Because facial recognition became a gigantic thing, didn't it? The Apple Macintosh operating system, when you use photos, it scrapes all the faces, whether you like it or not. If anybody's looking for anybody, they just ask the computer behind the scenes, hey, you know where this face is? Oh, yeah, I found it. Oh, it's a picture. It's not the person's computer, but they're in the crowd at Disneyland. And here's the geographic location, and here's the time and day, and the index of time. So you know the GMT differential, right? But they created Boston Dynamics through a company called Big Dog. They're now working on self-driving cars. They're also a big part of the brain technology that supposedly Elon Musk is going for to control your mind. All these movies I've done for you are part and parcel the predictive programming as to what they actually wanted to do in the real world. It just takes sometimes half a century to actually get it working. But the last two doozies are the hypersonic missile, i.e. hypersonic aircraft. And of course, that little problem we have from 2020 to about 2023, they were responsible for the technology that was deployed into everyone's body back in those days. And of course, you got some speculation that stuff had a lot of little mechanical devices in it. I never took it, so I'll never know. Now, one of the other things that Andrew said was that he was a member of Mensa. And I have a very interesting experience with Mensa out of Caltech. I had a very close friend of mine, and I mean extremely close friend of mine. She was one of the fellows at the Caltech Mensa. She'd been in it for pretty much her whole life, and her father was this amazing inventor who was worth several $100 million for his inventions. When her and I first met, we hit it off really, really well. And she was the girlfriend of a best friend of mine who's still around. She's passed, by the way. She got the regiment and suddenly came down with cancer and died very quickly. Unbelievable. But she wanted me in badly. She was like, you got to come. You're the exact kind of guy, blah, blah, blah. And so I did all of the preliminary testing, did really well. And I started studying what they're covering at the Caltech Mensa. And it turned out that it was pretty much 99.9% complete BS propaganda. They were trying to get the minds of these really exceptional kids who were, again, not necessarily socially exceptional, but academically exceptional, to buy into all of the BS, which for me defeated any logic that these people were actually intelligent. And so I did not officially start going to their meetings, but I did all of the inducting work to get into the organization, which is odd because I believe my mutual friend who tried to get me in was not subscribing to a lot of that stuff, but we didn't waste our time with a lot of that stuff. We talked about much more intense stuff going on. So being a member is something you can do if you want to. They'll mail you the test. And what ends up happening is they mail you a sample test that you do. It's an IQ test. It's a true IQ test. And then once you get your score satisfactory, you can just keep taking it. It's like, I forgot, $35 or something like that. Then you pay, I think, $7,500, whatever, and you go down to whatever Mensa organization you're going to join. It's in your local area, and you test into it. And then they send you a boatload of email. I still got all the emails, and it hasn't changed. I mean, literally, once you read the email, you're like, oh my God, it's a bunch of fake agendas, fake fear mongering. It's unbelievable. I couldn't say that I have this show and walk in and announce myself. But if I lectured, the teachers would probably throw me out, or whoever the hell's in charge would be throwing me out. So that is not as impressive as you might think. There are other organizations over Mensa. One's called Prometheus. That one I haven't investigated much, but it's supposed to be a little more highbrow. What you need is an organization that will let you be really scientific and not being censored. So let's talk about the Coast to Coast AM appearance of Andrew, because there was a very interesting distinction, and those of you who are OG listeners will be very familiar with this because I've mentioned it several times, but I didn't know Andrew's name. I just remembered this being on there, and this is where we get extremely skeptical about Andrew's story. Because he says he's been to other planets, not just Mars, but other alien planets and spent time there. I believe in the Coast to Coast AM interview, I heard him say that he had spent up to 2 years there. And that's like an exchange program. And of course, once you see Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and you're looking for sort of material to create a conspiracy, you see Richard Dreyfuss get in a red jumpsuit, along with several other gentlemen who are, I think, carrying a briefcase as well. But they're about to head off into the mothership at the end of the movie. And so this exchange program was portrayed within the movie beautifully. And of course, I believe it's more Hollywood than anything else, but it would be fantastic. And it doesn't have to do anything with time travel to be a foreign exchange student with another alien life form. But there was 2 calls that came in that were very interesting. And I actually thought this individual identified himself, and I looked it up today, and actually he's a mysterious individual. But he had called in. I'm listening to this. I remember being in my car listening to this because I had a mutual friend of mine that would also text me like, listen to this Coast to Coast. This is going to be great tonight, you know. And thank God for him that I got to hear a lot of these things. But I was a fan even before that. But a gentleman calls in and says, you know who I am. You keep saying that I have traveled with you. I've been with you. Stop using my name. Stop mentioning me because I have never been anywhere with you. Now, what's interesting is some of the claims online claim that the gentleman said he had actually traveled, but he hasn't traveled with Andrew. What I heard was he had never traveled. This whole thing was a lie, and stop mentioning his name. And the interesting thing is that Andrew is smart. He's a very intelligent guy. So his response back to this guy on live radio was, well, I understand your opinion, but what you don't know is that you haven't traveled with me yet. And what's strange about that is the project was concluded, I think, by the time he was on Coast to Coast. He didn't say the project was still going. So what he was talking about was some bubble in time where this guy who was living in the present hadn't bumped into a program that was already concluded, but that he was going to travel with Andrew sometime in the future. Interesting how you have these sort of paradoxes of commenting, but it was good enough to throw the guy into a weird, status with the listeners, right? But then another guy calls in because they turn it over to the outside public, right? I think that guy I'm talking about was one of the first calls, and he had pounded the producers taking the calls to let him in early, right? If I remember that right. But someone else called in and said, I really love your story. He was very congratulatory and nice. And he says, you said you spent 2 years on another planet, an alien planet. Talk to me about what it looks like on the other side. A fair question for a person. Outrageous claims need outrageous evidence, right? I think it was Carl Sagan loved that term, right? That phrase. Well, this guy is a couple beats in the script, man. He does not know what to say, because he needs to say something. It should have been right off the cuff. If you had seen something, if you had just recently got back from Paris and I had never been to Paris, never even seen a picture of it, and I'm asking that question, I mean, at least metaphorically, you should be able to start answering, oh my gosh, okay, it was like nothing you've ever seen before, nothing I had ever seen before. You're not really saying anything, but you're starting to flower up the next thing, and you're thinking while you're saying that flowery comment, right? And it's like this little palm reading exercise, right? But he says, well, it looked like Earth. It looked like here. Something to that effect. He said it looked like here. All right, well, let's look at the universe before we just let that comment pass. Let's say we go official solar system definition of where we are, okay? Because that's definitely where Andrew is, right? You got the sun, and you got these planets and these orbital indexes away from the sun. So Mercury is the first index, Venus the next one, all the way out to the rocks that are Pluto that didn't turn into gas giants because they weren't planets. It's safe to estimate, because we're here on Earth, right, that the Earth index, which you might call the Gaia index, where Earth is, third rock from the sun, is a very coveted agricultural location, meaning whatever rock gets to this point, whatever electrically inflated crust that exists at this orbit gets blue water, green algae, and the ability to maintain life for mankind. Again, we're going to take all official evolution, whatever, even alien drop-off. It all fits in that definition. Aliens probably can't drop off an armadillo on Venus. They probably can't drop off a duck-billed platypus on Mars. There's just not enough air. There's not enough of what it takes. It'd have to be a completely different creature. It'd have to be like something from Andromeda Strain, right? Another movie I covered you should check out. So the idea that he's saying that wherever he went is in this Gaia index, right? That's the only way it could be. It's like all those funny shows like, the BBC's Red Dwarf I mentioned earlier, right? A lot of time travel and back to Earth episodes, right? Even when they're in medieval times or some other timetable. But they show up always in a forest, and you immediately know, okay, the show's trying to save a few bucks by just obviously not creating some set that Star Trek created, even as early as the 60s. They are even Forbidden Planet, right? Where they blew out a huge set of what it looks like to be on another planet. Nah, just film in the backyard and write a story about being in prehistoric Earth, right? I think it's safe to say that whatever atmosphere any planet ends up creating anywhere, if indeed these things exist as we understand them, would be so unbelievably unique, right? It would be like trying to find a pasta in China matching a pasta in Italy versus New York versus LA versus your kitchen in Kansas. They're all going to be different because that's just the way they came into fruition. They're all built out of different things, different diameters of the planets, different cycles of the universe would create differences between them. The sky wouldn't necessarily be blue because that's a chemical reflection of light officially, right? So the idea that the sky can't come up with a single difference. The atmosphere is really dry. Honestly, the sky is not blue. It's sort of like a weird yellow blue. It's really strange. It's like a pale blue, and nights are so dark you can't even imagine it because there's this weird anomaly just making it up, right? Just as a writer, if you needed to make something special, it wouldn't take a whole hell of a lot to metaphorically say it's a little bit different. All the vegetation glows. All of their architecture is actually very smooth and elven-like. It's just strange how they do it. Everything they do is very smooth. When they create UFOs, it's all some injection molded thing. Or they have a spinning apparatus where they drop a little dab of metal and it spins it out. And then they heat up and glue the top part to the bottom part. Who knows, right? I had a dream where I saw that once. Wild. What is very interesting about people like Andrew is that the guts that these individuals have. Andrew's very different from someone like a Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar is willing to take as many interviews as possible. And I rewatched the first, 12 years of Bob Lazar's interviews, and I noticed something very distinct. If you were to take a college class and you say, this is the Bob Lazar college class, and one of the exercises was to you buy a little tiny notebook, right? And that notebook is devoted to the first interview. And then you set that aside And in that notebook, you're responsible for putting all the details of what he describes. And then you listen to the next interview and you create another notebook with all the bullets inside. You're going to realize that he's adding bullets. The details that he adds are sort of unbelievable. For instance, and again, we're just analyzing the potential that maybe this was a made-up story. Okay, I still have respect for the balls it takes to do this, honestly. And it's entertaining, right? Whatever, right? So Bob says he goes to S4 on the first day, and all he mentions is seeing one craft. But if you continue watching his interviews, by the time he gets to 2000, because I've said it several times on the show, and I just went through watching 10 years of his interviews, and I realized he wasn't mentioning stuff that I've been mentioning in my shows, because I caught the last interviews he took. I've been telling you guys he saw 9. And then so you fast forward about 10 years, he suddenly saw 9. There were 8, and then the one he worked on, which he called the supermodel, which again, I modeled in the season 5 intro. But he just says in the next interview, when he introduces the other 8, that's all he says. He says he saw 8 more. Then you watch a couple of years later, and now all 8 were damaged. All 8 actually had some sort of impact on their outer hull that might have been responsible for the reason why we got a hold of them. Now, the idea that in the very first time you say you enter S4 and you see 9 craft, not 1, why would you not mention the other 8? And then why would it evolve later on that the 8 are actually damaged? I think it's because the narration is being created live, right? You get tired of saying the same old thing if you're making up a story, right? I know that, a lot of musicians that have to sing the same song every single time they go on stage. One of the reasons why they don't necessarily want to go on tour again, if they have plenty of money, because they're singing the same old songs. If they could be allowed to change the lyrics and maybe update the song a little bit, maybe they go out because they would have juiced it up. When I saw Adam Ant in 1994, some 10 years after his career was kind of over for the very first time, he had completely re-engineered most of the songs. The lyrics are still the same, but the arrangements were wild, and it was like almost a Reznor version of his concert. By the way, I saw him sing Goody Two Shoes, and you could see a guy just cringing trying to say those lyrics, man, because he had evolved so far past that teeny bop stuff. But we have things like this, other programs. The one that I'm kind of skipping over, which is a kind of a climate of when Andrew was saying he was being inducted as a child into these programs. Right around the time that he was a kid, they had that project that was part of remote viewing, which was oddly called Project Stargate. I just mentioned this in a recent episode. But of course, they are spending tons of money on this, and it was officially like up to maybe $30 million. Now, you'll hear rumors that they laundered up to $1 billion in various research programs. That very well may be true, but individual above ground funding from Congress or something like that, even in these black ops things, it still doesn't get written down like that, because that starts making people go, what? $1.3 billion? I remember a science, was a Sci-Fi Channel special was trying to claim it was over $1 billion in these things. And, do I think $1 billion would have been pushed into these organizations? For sure. But through that particular line item, I don't know. But a lot of the remote viewing, which I won't go too deep into, but it's obviously individuals that say they can astral project their vision and see things anywhere in the universe. I've heard people claim as much as being on Mars and finding buildings and going inside them, to going on the moon and going inside facilities that exist, but they're ancient and barren. Oh, maybe, I guess. But they did have this guy I just mentioned recently called Pat Price. And officially speaking, Pat was not a sort of original member of any, remote viewing. But he was pulled into this remote viewing organization by a guy named Hal Puthoff and then Russell Targ, who had this little division in the intelligence agency kind of studying phenomenon, right? Sort of the psychic phenomenon realm. And Pat was not only claiming to be a remote viewer, but he was also making tons of predictions. And he had actually worked for I think Boston police force or something, which is sort of the Stephen King novel Dead Zone, where they made the movie with Christopher Walken. And this has been something that goes back in time, where people will help police agencies all throughout the world over the course of history touch items and claim that they can find bodies and that kind of stuff. In a lot of cases, they do. Now, when this stuff is analyzed a little later, they try to look at the law of averages. Again, if I said I got a number between 1 and 10 in my mind, and you're trying to guess it, you're obviously going to get it right more often than if I say I have a number between 1 and 20. But 21% accuracy is considered complete randomness. Isn't that interesting? It's still pretty impressive that you would get it right. Anytime you say 4 and I go, man, that's it. If you get 2 in a row, boy, you feel amazing. So if you're put into a capacity where you're predicting and predicting and predicting, there's guys that predict earthquakes all the time. I get emails from friends, an earthquake's going to take place. And it's like, well, eventually you're going to be right. So don't go crazy when you don't realize out of 365 days out of the year, you've sent me 50 predictions and one of them goes right. And we're living in an area that has earthquakes, right? And then what do you consider a real earthquake? Is it a 5.0 and up? Because there's one that's happening every day in California. They're just teeny tiny. The Pat was actually put in lots of specials on TV where he had actually was told to predict what a complex in the Soviet Union looked like. And he wrote down a bunch of stuff, and then they finally figured out what it looked like through some ground intel, and they said, oh my God, this is very similar. But when they really looked at what actually took place, they're like, well, this is pretty vague, what he wrote down. There's a door, and there's a wall, and there's a ceiling, and there's a big room, and there's a desk there with a briefcase. Stuff that you would probably be able to predict. I should say a palm reader should be able to predict, or someone reading your tarot cards. If you study cold reading and warm reading, it's amazing how these individuals have done this if they've done it for 2 decades, oh my God, you walk in there and they're reading you like a book. They just know from a couple words out of your mouth how, even if you're being defensive, I don't want to tell you anything about my life, well, now it's all about your life. It's all personal. They just can read right through you. Any inflections you give as they're talking to you, they can make a sentence, run-on sentence, last forever, and they're looking at your face as every word comes out of their mouth. And as your face changes with certain words, they know, it's about the girlfriend. It looks like I'm looking at his hand, and there's a little depression where the wedding ring used to be. He's recently divorced, or there is a wedding ring, and he's twirling that thing like crazy. They're doing all that kind of stuff. So imagine combining that with a program that's saying that it's producing results for upper echelon. If it doesn't actually help something really happen in the real world, then it just may be coincidence, right? But the interesting thing about Pat was he died supposedly of a heart attack in a hotel at the age of 57, at the very height of his supposedly predicting things about the Soviet Union. And this is 1975, okay? So there's conspiracies that I think, you should consider it, that potentially if you had spooked your enemy enough that maybe, if I said you're trying to get into someone's house and the key is to find a door other than the front door, and then I think to myself, well, there's probably a back door, and I get it right. And it's just the way you got into the house, and that person getting into your house got something valuable from you. And you found out it's because I told them there's a door in the back. And I said, I'm psychic and it's magical. Well, let's say you're trying to hide a lot of stuff in a lot of houses, and I'm sitting there you're hearing that I can predict how to get into your house, your houses. I can find your stuff, right? I believe one of the specials was that they were trying to predict what was on a piece of paper in a briefcase at one point. But nothing was scientifically recreatable. And so even if there was a level of accuracy in one day, they couldn't reproduce it the next day. And that doesn't really create anything that's valuable, right? Well, I fired a gun and it hit the target. Well, the next 20 times I tried, I was hitting the dirt behind the target, right? The odd thing about it was that they never did an autopsy on his body. Well, if he was poisoned by a foreign agency, you would think that a toxicology report, especially looking for shellfish venom, or the 32 venoms that are out there that makes you get a headache, lose your taste, and have heart problems. There's a recent thing that might have been a bioweapon that does that. But any venom in the world creates those three symptoms because it just hits the very same area of the brain, whether or not it comes out of a shellfish or a king cobra, which I believe there's a facility in Wuhan, China that milks cobras. Very interesting. Anyway, random thought. So you would think he would check it out. Now, if he was hit by our own organization, that would explain why he was never given a proper autopsy and a proper toxicology report. Again, looking for things that take out your intelligence, people. Take out your valuable assets. But there might also be an element where you don't want to admit that your enemy got you. And so you do that report and you just don't publish it, because then that kind of makes it a public record that we weren't able to protect one of our guys. And if you have a lot of valuable assets in these organizations, you don't want them getting spooked out that the people that say they could protect you can't protect you, right? But we got a little time left here. Let's look at maybe the psychological causality of an individual that might make something like this up. I'm not saying Andrew made it up, but let's just say that there are people out there that reach a certain point in their life where, life is starting to sunset a little bit. There's a point in a man's life where he gets old enough that, the younger girls are no longer access to him. If he's still attracted to, 20-year-olds or whatever, he's never going to get that opportunity again. And that starts to create a wild thing in the mind if that's what you're attracted to, if you don't like your own age. My problem was I like girls older than me. So you want to have some blip in your life. You want to have some notoriety. You want to feel special for something. And if you are a super intelligent person anyway, an L. Ron Hubbard kind of guy, maybe you've actually found some technology that can actually help a person, get in touch with their life, either be conceptual information that's put into the mind or a machine that can test you somehow. I think Hubbard had all those things. So you wrap it up inside of a religion for that guy. Kinda. A system of belief, if nothing else. Now, the courageous nature of an individual that would have to sit down, because logistically, let's break this down. You're going to start making waves that you were a part of this Project Pegasus. Well, now, I have a channel here, and I've got a little over, 6,000 of you subscribe, which I feel very privileged to have. We'd probably have 6 million if we weren't censored. But I feel good with what we're doing here. And let's just say I want to create some sort of conspiracy like that. I've told you my experiences, I believe, with at least one alien, and potentially two, actually three total. And let's say I want to bounce that into something I can get on George Norrie, Coast to Coast AM, or some other podcast of that kind. I'm going to have to get my ducks in a row, aren't I? I'm going to have to look at my entire life and say, okay, where is my life fairly undocumented by the world? And again, pre-internet kids are probably one of the last species that can ever do this because we weren't videotaped constantly. I mean, I'm so glad my whole life wasn't videotaped until I wanted it to be somehow online. Well, if you're smart, you're going to have to figure out what you're kind of good at, right? What are you going to be able to describe with any level of accuracy? Because there should be a lot of questions once you start making some massive claims. And so, for instance, the entire foundation of Project Pegasus, as pitched to the world, was unpublished papers of Tesla, but most people know you don't know anything about Tesla, right? You haven't watched all my episodes on the guy. I have a 2-hour episode on him that if you watch it, you're going to get tons of information, pretty much everything there was to know about this guy. My Scalar Pulses episode, which teaches you probably how he did the Wardenclyffe Tower, et cetera, right? So you find some ambiguous division in science, and then you mention fancy words like quantum mechanics, right? Quantum mechanics is kind of like saying driving a car. there's very different implementations of driving cars, from truck drivers to F1 Formula racers, right? Completely different knowledge bases and objectives in all the different ways that we have. Quantum mechanics has got, quite frankly, an infinite amount of applications. So you mentioned something that kind of blurs the line of, you can't contest me because I'm going to mention two very ambiguous things, and I'm not going to offer any information about what's in these containers. It's one of those old adages, a person who's not very intelligent tries to be intelligent by playing this one game. Guess what's in my hands? For the listeners, I'm cupping my hands together. You don't know what's between my two hands? Well, you're an idiot. That's how an ignorant person tries to be a genius. They hide something from you, and because you don't know what they've put behind your back or whatever they're hiding, they feel intelligent. A lot of IT guys are like this, right? They'll never tell you how it works. That's why Jimmy Fallon made that reoccurring skit on SNL where he was the IT guy. He wouldn't tell anybody how anything. He wouldn't teach them how to fish, right? Then he wasn't a very good fisherman anyway. The thing is to offer a contrast for those of you who saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind. If you haven't, you're missing out. One of the greatest films ever made. Richard Dreyfuss joins this mothership. But what's interesting about the way his character was written was that he didn't invent any of the technology that they used to communicate with the aliens at the ending of the film. He simply was possessed by these sightings. He kept trying to build a pyramid until he found out it was Devil's Tower. He goes to Devil's Tower. He gets through great hardship to the communication at the very end, and then he simply gets on the ship. And that makes sense. He's not in charge. He didn't build the phonics system that was going back and forth algorithmically with the mothership. And if I were Andrew, I would have positioned myself in that capacity. But that's not what he said. He said at least one claim was that he was the leader of this Project Pegasus at one point when he gained the age to do so. Now, that may be a bogus claim that he never made that claim, and if that's the case, then that's good. But if I was in charge of a time travel teleportation technology, I would assume at some point that at least an inkling of how this technology worked would have been disclosed to me. And, hey, if you're talking about this, then your gag order is over, right? I mean, someone would pop you if you're talking about this, even typing this in the 21st century. They'll know when that TCP/IP packet travels over the internet, easy for me to say, they're going to know exactly what you're talking about, and they'll come get you. But since they're not, then maybe it's not as true as we might have been told. But to not be able to describe it, for me, is sort of a big sort of red alert thing, right? But let's go back to our analogy. We have to get our act together because we're going to come up with a conspiracy of some sort. Well, let's say we take my experience in Oxnard, California, where I woke up and an alien's right in front of me telling me what was in one of my Christmas presents, and the dude was right. A present I couldn't even conceive of. Had someone put a gun to my head, I wouldn't have been able to even describe it. If they told me what it was, I couldn't describe it properly. Okay, so I got this little seed of something I think really took place. My girlfriend confirmed the whole thing. Okay, wonderful. Now, how could I take that and move it up into something, right? Well, I'd probably go with the Whitley Strieber claim, which is maybe he had a real experience, but then he had a bunch of experiences. By the time he wrote his second book, he's having every experience that every other person has ever had. You read the book. He traveled all over the United States and talked to hundreds of people. And after every single testimony of it was a transformation book, I think it is, he says in the book, well, that's funny because I had the same exact experience. Well, it's like one of those people, you go, hey, do you know how that works? No. And then you tell them, they go, oh, well, I knew that. Okay, well, now that I told you, it's great, right? But I would have to go with that kind of situation where I start saying, well, you know what started happening after that? I was being abducted by these folks, or they were coming into my house telling me how to program. The albums I made in the 90s, they were writing the music for me. Whatever great accomplishment I have, I pawn it off on aliens and I say, I'm really not that smart. It's just all these folks tell me every place to be at a particular time and everything just worked out, right? But if I ever said I was abducted, consciously, I never went to sleep, Well, I got to talk about the whole travel. I got to talk about the whole trip. And I'm going to have to think that thing through. And if I'm not a writer, well, it might not be as easy as it looks, right? But let's just have some fun real quick before the show's over. If I said I ever walked into an alien craft, it was big enough I could stand up, which according to Bob Lazar, none of them are. But there's a lot of theories of these giant cylinders in the sky and flying cigars. Again, my grandmother saw what she said were cigar-shaped vehicles floating over the plains of Kansas in the 1910s, okay? She's born in 12. She said she was having these visions with her sister, Gladys, by the 1920, okay? She said they made no noise at all. They just floated over the plains, and we used to just watch them. And technically speaking, blimp technology was not supposed to be in that area of the world. Probably was. That's probably what they were. But she said a little smoke came out of the back of them, too. But if I said I walked inside of an alien craft, I think one of the things, if I was truly awake and not dreaming, would be smell, right? First thing would be the scent of the air. Does it have a scent? Do these guys bathe? What are the, there's been a lot of talk about how they don't bathe and they're really disgusting beings. Really kind of funny. Super technological, but don't bathe. And they don't have any ailments as a result of that. What would be some of the other senses we would probably report back? The warmth of the vehicle. What was the air? Do they know I need to stay at a certain temperature? Because if I go too low, I'm going to get hypothermia. If I get too hot, I'm going to pass out and die. Do they know all this about me? My feet on the ground. What's that metal going to feel like? Is it going to feel hollow? Is it going to feel heavy? What's it going to be like? Do they communicate with me in any way verbally? What are the sounds like in the room? Is there any ambient sounds from the machines? I mean, is there like a Star Trek, captain's deck? Or is it pure silence? Is it so quiet that it's almost eerie? What would it be like to travel in one of their vehicles? Do you even feel a blip of inertia? Do you feel little punches and pulls as they're going 8,000 miles an hour one way and change directions? Or when they start going interstellar, do I feel anything? Do I feel a little blip? And the one thing I've never heard described, especially by Bob Lazar, is they don't talk about the door into these vehicles ever. The supermodel. Well, how's the door work, dude? And how do you get it open in the first place, right? One of the early stories that Bob was talking about was that he was actually hired because the two scientists prior to him being there tried to open an antimatter engine, and they got it to open, but it exploded on them and killed them. So he was actually being brought in to replace them, which is actually a very clever way of saying, because he said this, he goes, I wasn't the most intelligent person there by any means, but it was almost like I was science fodder. What I was going to be working on was very technically dangerous, and so they just kind of wanted a monkey to go in and mess around and see if it exploded on him. But he turned out to be, he's definitely a super intelligent person. There's no doubt about that. But there's no, day the earth stood still kind of door. There isn't the hatch underneath the Forbidden Planet saucer where it just comes down with a ladder and a cord attached to it, right? So again, these outrageous claims, there's got to be a little bit more meat on the bone for a person like myself. But what's interesting about it is if you get on podcasts or AM radio stations and you are talking to a host that doesn't bring anything extra, or the host is simply saying, you know what, I'm selling asses in seats. We got sponsorship. We need to, have some Nielsen rating of how many people are listening to our show, which I don't know how they do anymore. I don't want to interrupt the guest. I want them to entertain. I'm here to enable them and their story, which makes honestly complete business sense, right? For a podcast, well, maybe you talk to a person that's got a pretty good sense about them. But I think if I make a prediction that's correct at all, here's my clairvoyance of the whole thing. We're going to see a lot of this sort of stuff peter away. These are the last dinosaurs to come up with these stories because people's histories are completely tracked. They may not be tracked by you personally, but I think a lot of you know that you can buy services that have apps on your phone, that little poker game you never play, the little solitaire game on your phone. If your phone isn't protecting you from getting GPS coordinates burst out from like Instagram and Facebook and all these other organizations that have the right to resell your data, then they could just pull you up and look where you've been in a GPS system for the last 20 years of your life, as long as you have your phone on you. Well, then you're going to be able to say, you're going to be able to say to them, well, I didn't see you leave planet Earth ever. Oh, that's when the phone was on my nightstand and, you just, it didn't move while I was on another planet. I came back before sun up, There should be some sort of like Oscar award for individuals who have claimed these sorts of things, and make it awards based on original concept, on validated stories, on claim stories and creativity, just whatever it is, and just hand them out. I think that'd be really cool. And then you could get notoriety for what you're really doing, which is entertaining the public. And, I think it's pretty safe to say people are pretty bored with reality, which is why we spend so much time diving into this stuff. And I love it, don't you? Anyway, I hope you feel me on this one. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. It's getting updated all the time. Lots of categories. In case you like a particular subject matter, you just click that category. All the podcasts and videos all ready for you. And understand, there's a lot of playlists inside the YouTube channel as well. But if you want to watch this on some other video platform, we're on BitChute.com 100%, Rumble 93% or so. Their interface is so bad I can't audit my videos. But if you're coming on video and you want audio, that's your links. If you want to get notice of the videos on different social media than the ones that are the commandos of the deep state, well, there's Minds.com, Gab, there's Getter, and a few others. So it's all up there. Go get yourself some. We have a store up there with a lot of cool shirts. A lot of folks have been buying lots of shirts, so thank you so much. And for those of you who support me on Patreon or PayPal, thank you so much. Patreon is completely free now. I wasn't posting enough to keep it a paid tier. There is a $5 tier up there if you want to donate. But if you do that, you're definitely a warrior for Deep Thoughts. I appreciate it. But anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you on the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.